Rebecca Carter walked through the grand entrance of Sterling Bank, her heels tapping softly against the polished marble floors. It was her bank, her empire, yet she stood in line just like any other customer. Not a single staff member recognized her. Rebecca wasn't dressed in her usual high-end designer attire today. She wore a simple navy blouse and well-tailored slacks, her hair neatly tied back in a sleek bun, and her makeup minimal, leaving only the subtle air of power that radiated from her. Her presence, her posture, was the dead giveaway, head high, shoulders straight, each step exuding quiet confidence. But here, in this moment, none of that mattered to them. She was just another woman in line. As she waited, she glanced around at the bank's modern design, the soaring ceilings, the sleek floor-to-ceiling windows letting in soft natural light, the high-end security cameras placed unobtrusively throughout the space. Every detail had been meticulously chosen to project an image of excellence. It was her work, her vision, that had brought Sterling Bank to life, every policy, every loan, every business deal bearing her stamp. Yet, in this moment, she was just another black woman waiting to be served, ignored and dismissed. The line moved slowly. Rebecca's eyes briefly flicked to the young man at the front counter who had just finished assisting another customer. He was tall, with slick-back blonde hair and a somewhat smug expression. His gaze swept over Rebecca, but there was no hint of recognition in his eyes. Next, the teller called. Rebecca stepped forward, but he barely looked up from his computer. "What can I do for you today?" he asked, his tone flat. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," Rebecca replied, sliding her debit card across the counter. The teller took her card and flipped it between his fingers, briefly glancing at the name on the card before letting out a soft chuckle. "You related to the owner or something?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Rebecca's lips curled into a faint, controlled smile. "Something like that," she replied. The teller scoffed, shaking his head. "Must be nice. How much?" "50,000, she said smoothly, maintaining eye contact. The teller's fingers paused mid-tap on the keyboard, his expression faltering. He glanced up at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. 50,000, he muttered under his breath, his lips pursing. "Do you have ID?" Rebecca slid her driver's license across the counter without hesitation, watching as his eyes darted between her face and the ID. "Hold on a second," he said abruptly, his tone shifting to something more guarded. He stood up, walking toward the back of the bank where the manager was sitting. The two exchanged words in low voices, the manager's gaze flicking toward Rebecca for a brief moment. He nodded as the teller returned to the counter. "I'm sorry, but I can't process this withdrawal right now," he said, his voice strained. "It's just bank policy. Large withdrawals need additional verification." Rebecca raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "Do you always ask for all this documentation when a white man in a suit comes to withdraw money?" The teller flinched at the question, and irritation flickered in his eyes, but he quickly masked it. "Look, I don't make the rules," he said, shaking his head. "If you don't have the proper documents, I can't help you." Rebecca took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had fought this battle before, whether in boardrooms, business negotiations, or in institutions like this one. It was always the same: people saw her, and their judgment was clouded by stereotypes. But she had built this institution. It wasn't just a bank to her, it was her life's work. And yet, here she was, being questioned about her ability to withdraw money. "Let me get this straight," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "You're refusing to release my money, my own money, because I don't look the part?" The teller rolled his eyes, his exasperation showing. "I don't have time for this," he muttered, a dismissive tone creeping into his voice. "If you have a problem, take it up with the manager." Rebecca smiled slowly, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, I will." Rebecca strode toward the back office, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, the silence in the bank thickening with each step she took. She didn't knock, didn't ask for permission. She simply opened the door and walked inside. The manager, a stocky man with graying hair and a nervous expression, looked up from his desk, clearly startled. "Excuse me, miss, but you can't just—" "I can," Rebecca interrupted, closing the door behind her with a firm click. She wasn't interested in pleasantries. "And I will," she added, her voice cool and unwavering. The manager stiffened, glancing toward the door as if hoping someone might walk in to save him from this confrontation, but no one did. "I'm Rebecca Carter," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "As in Sterling Bank. As in the woman who owns this bank. And right now, I have a teller out there refusing to give me my own money because he assumes I don't belong here." The manager's face paled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. He looked like he was trying to process what had just been said, but the words hung heavy in the air between them. His throat worked before he found his voice. "Miss Carter, I had no idea." Rebecca cut him off with a cold tilt of her head. "You didn't, and that's the problem." The manager wiped his brow, his eyes darting toward the door again, but there was no escape. "I assure you, this is just a misunderstanding. Our policies are strict about large withdrawals." It wasn't personal. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "That's the thing," she said slowly. "It's always personal when people like me have to jump through hoops for something that should be routine. When a white customer in a suit asks for his money, he's treated like a valued client. But when I do it, suddenly I need to prove I belong. Explain that to me." The manager shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes flicking to the door again. Our policies are just enforced this way. It's for security, Miss Carter, for safety," he stammered, his voice faltering. Rebecca leaned in, her gaze locking onto him. "I don't think you quite understand," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "I'm not here to discuss your policies. I'm here to discuss your employees' behavior and, more importantly, how you're going to fix this." For a moment, the manager hesitated, his lips trembling as he sought an escape from the situation, but Rebecca wasn't finished. "You're going to walk out of this office," she continued, her voice firm. "You're going to call that teller, Jacob, over, and you're going to correct this mistake in front of every single person in that lobby, loudly. Because if I walk out there and handle it myself, it won't be a correction. It'll be a public reckoning." The manager hesitated, his face a mixture of fear and confusion, his eyes flickering to the door as if looking for a way out, but there was none. Rebecca's words hung in the air like a guillotine, and he knew she meant every word. With a shaky nod, the manager rose from his chair, his movements stiff and reluctant. Rebecca followed him closely, her presence a reminder that this moment was far from over. As they stepped back into the lobby, the energy in the room shifted. Customers whispered among themselves, sensing the tension. The teller, Jacob, was still standing behind his counter, his eyes narrowed in annoyance as he glanced at the manager and Rebecca, clearly unaware of the reckoning that was about to unfold. The manager cleared his throat and called to Jacob, his voice shaky. "Jacob, step away from the counter." Jacob frowned but obeyed, his arms crossed over his chest. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. The manager took a deep breath, standing tall, his voice now firm. "I want to publicly address a serious mistake that occurred today," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "Rebecca Carter, the owner of Sterling Bank, was denied access to her own funds because of an inappropriate and unfair assumption made by one of our tellers." Jacob's smirk faltered, his face drained of color. Murmurs rippled through the lobby, and some customers exchanged knowing looks. The realization of what had just been said settled like a heavy weight in the air. Jacob's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked between the manager and Rebecca, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Wait," he stammered, she's the owner?" "You heard me," the manager said firmly, his voice now resolute. "Miss Carter is the CEO and owner of this bank. You refused her service without proper cause, and in doing so, You violated not only our policies but the very values this institution stands for." Rebecca stood tall, her arms crossed, her expression unwavering. She met Jacob's gaze directly, her eyes piercing through him like a sharp blade. "Something wrong, Jacob?" she asked coolly. Jacob's face flushed, his throat working as he tried to find the words. "I didn't know," he muttered, his voice shaking. "You didn't bother to know," Rebecca replied smoothly. "You saw my face, my skin, and decided I couldn't possibly be someone important." The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. The silence in the lobby deepened as the full realization of his mistake set in. The manager's voice broke through the tension. "Effective immediately, Jacob, you're fired." Jacob stood frozen in place, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The weight of the situation hit him all at once, and the smug expression that had once adorned his face now disappeared, replaced by an almost frantic disbelief. He looked around, desperate for an escape, but there was no way out. His eyes flickered nervously toward the lobby, where the customers were watching him, and he could feel their eyes drilling into his back. The silence in the room was thick, charged with the weight of Rebecca's words. Her gaze was unrelenting, her posture tall and firm, as though she were daring him to say something, anything, to justify his actions. But there was nothing he could say. The manager swallowed hard and repeated the verdict. "Jacob, you're fired, effective immediately." At the words, a ripple of gasps spread through the lobby. Some customers exchanged glances, others shifted in their seats, uncertain of what would happen next. The air in the room was electric, everything had shifted. No one would forget what had just transpired here today. Jacob stood motionless for a moment, as if the words hadn't fully registered in his mind. But when they did, his eyes widened, his face contorted in shock and rage. "You can't fire me," he snapped, his voice rising in pitch. "You're only doing this because she's the boss. If she wasn't, you wouldn't care." Rebecca's expression remained cool and collected, her voice cutting through his words like a blade. "That's exactly the problem, Jacob," she said calmly. "You've spent your whole life judging people by how they look instead of who they are. The difference between you and me is that I don't need luck to get what I deserve. I'm prepared." Jacob sneered, his face twisting with fury, but there was nothing more he could say. The manager, looking utterly defeated, stepped aside and motioned for Jacob to leave. "Please, Jacob, just go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Without another word, Jacob turned on his heel and stormed toward the door, his face flushed with anger. He shot one last glance at Rebecca, his eyes filled with contempt, before pushing through the glass doors and disappearing into the street. As the door closed behind him, the entire bank seemed to exhale in unison. For a moment, the room was eerily silent, but then, slowly at first, a single person began to clap. Then another joined in. Soon, the entire lobby was applauding, some customers nodding at Rebecca with admiration, others whispering amongst themselves. The manager stood at the center of the room, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. He cleared his throat, his voice unsteady as he tried to regain his composure. I apologize to everyone here for what happened," he said, his gaze flicking nervously to Rebecca. "Sterling Bank does not condone discrimination in any form. What occurred today was unacceptable, and I assure you, it will be addressed immediately." Rebecca gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Good," she said simply. "I'll expect a full report on this later." With that, the applause began to die down, and the customers returned to their business, but the atmosphere in the bank had shifted permanently. The power dynamics had changed. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about dignity, justice, and the unspoken rules that had been exposed for all to see. Rebecca turned to the counter, where a new teller, Lila, a young Latina woman, was nervously waiting. Lila looked up at Rebecca, clearly recognizing her this time, her expression polite but unsure, as if she wasn't sure what to expect. Rebecca smiled, her eyes softening just a touch. "Would you be able to assist me with my withdrawal?" she asked, her voice calm and measured. Lila hesitated for a moment, then nodded quickly. "Of course, Miss Carter," she said, her tone more confident now. She took Rebecca's card, processing the transaction with steady hands. The air between them felt different. Lila was treating her with respect, not because of the power she held, but because she was a client who deserved it, just like anyone else. In under a minute, Rebecca's withdrawal was processed, the cash neatly counted and stacked. She placed it in her purse with a nod of thanks to Lila and turned to face the room one last time. "I built this bank so that people like me wouldn't have to fight for dignity," she said, her voice steady but filled with quiet strength. "If that standard isn't met every single day, then we aren't doing enough, and I expect more." With that, she turned and walked toward the exit, her head held high, her presence now undeniable. As the door swung open, she felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her, but this time it wasn't in disbelief. This time, they were acknowledging her, and that was all she needed. As Rebecca stepped out of Sterling Bank, the sunlight hit her face, warming her skin, but it wasn't the sun she felt the most, it was the weight of the moment. She had just forced the truth into the light. The battle wasn't over, but today, she had won. She walked toward her car, the world around her still buzzing, still alive. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. She fished it out, glancing at the screen. It was a text from her assistant, Naomi. "You set the bank on fire today. Twitter's already talking about it." "Someone filmed the whole thing," the message read. Rebecca chuckled softly, shaking her head. Of course, nothing happened in silence anymore. Naomi had sent a link to the video, and when Rebecca tapped it, the shaky recording began to play. It showed Jacob's smug face, the tension building in the lobby, the public firing, and her final words before walking out. The comments flooded in faster than Rebecca could read them. "This is the kind of justice we need more of." She walked in like a customer and left like a CEO. "Imagine losing your job because you decided to be racist in the wrong building." Rebecca smiled to herself. The internet was fast, and this had already become something much bigger than just a moment in a bank lobby. It was a statement, a movement. People were talking, and they were watching. As she slid into her car and started the engine, the hum of the vehicle settled her thoughts. She should have felt satisfied, even smug. After all, she had just exposed the discriminatory practices that still permeated the banking industry. But what she felt wasn't just satisfaction, it was something deeper, a responsibility. She had been fighting for years to make banking more accessible to minorities, and now, with the attention the video had garnered, it felt like the stakes were higher than ever. The fight wasn't just about one man's ignorance anymore, it was about changing an entire system. By the time Rebecca pulled into the parking lot of her corporate office, the weight of the day had settled into her bones. She stepped out of the car and walked through the glass doors of the building, nodding at the receptionist as she passed. Naomi was already waiting for her in her office, phone in hand, her expression unreadable. "You've got about a dozen interview requests," Naomi said before Rebecca even had a chance to sit down. "CNN, Forbes, even a couple of international outlets. Everyone wants to talk to you." Rebecca ran a hand through her hair, sitting down behind her desk with a sigh. "I didn't plan for this to be a spectacle," she muttered. Naomi grinned, clearly amused. "Well, too late for that. You called out discrimination in real time, fired a racist employee on the spot, and reminded the world that a black woman runs one of the biggest banks in the city. This is news." Rebecca leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "I know. I just don't want it to be about me. This is bigger than me." Naomi crossed her arms and sat on the edge of the desk, her expression turning serious. "That's exactly why you should talk, Rebecca. People need to see this, not just the drama, but the lesson. You've been fighting to make banking more accessible for minorities for years. Now the world actually cares. Rebecca stared at the ceiling for a long moment, knowing that Naomi was right. The fight she had started was bigger than just one moment. It was about showing the world the truth, about calling out the systemic injustices that still existed in industries like banking. Finally, she let out a long breath. "Fine. Set up the interviews," she said, her voice steady. Naomi's grin returned, but it was tempered with something else now: respect. "Already ahead of you." The next few days passed in a blur of press conferences, phone calls, and carefully crafted statements. Rebecca was thrust into the media spotlight, and the world wanted to know what went through her mind when she was denied access to her own money. News anchors praised her for holding a mirror up to the banking system, while activists hailed her as a beacon of change. But, as expected, the backlash came too. Predictably, some people downplayed the entire situation. "Why do people always have to make everything about race?" one person wrote. "So a guy got fired for following policy? Sounds like an overreaction to me." Rebecca ignored the noise. She wasn't in this fight for the applause, and she certainly wasn't going to let the critics drown out her message. The work was more important than the chatter. Then the phone call came that Rebecca had been expecting. Naomi rushed into the office, her eyes wide with urgency. She held up the phone without a word. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Who is it?" Naomi hesitated before speaking. "It's the board." Rebecca's stomach tightened. She knew this call was coming. Taking a steady breath, she picked up the phone. "Rebecca Carter," she said, her voice calm but alert. A deep voice greeted her. "Miss Carter, it's Edward Hollis. We need to talk." Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping against the desk. "I figured this call was coming." Edward sighed on the other end. "Look, you know how much we respect you. You've built this bank into something remarkable, but there's concern." "Concern?" Rebecca repeated flatly. "About what?" Another pause on the other end, and Rebecca could hear the discomfort in his voice. "Optics." Rebecca almost laughed. She had known these men long enough to predict their every move. "Let me guess," she said. "You're worried that me holding my own employees accountable might make some of our more conservative clients uncomfortable." Edward hesitated before answering. "It's not that simple, Rebecca." She exhaled slowly. "It never is." Rebecca stood at the head of the boardroom table, the room filled with executives who were both anxious and expectant. She could feel the weight of their gaze, the pressure mounting, but she was unshaken. This was her moment, and she wasn't backing down. "I've been thinking about the direction of this bank and our role in the industry," she began, her voice calm but firm. "We're launching a full audit of our policies, particularly how we serve minority clients. I want transparency, especially when it comes to loans, mortgages, and large cash withdrawals." There was a slight murmur around the table, the executives clearly unsure of what this would mean. Edward Hollis, the senior board member, cleared his throat. "Rebecca, you realize this will put a lot of eyes on us, right? We're talking about big changes." Rebecca met his gaze directly. "Good. Let them look." A younger executive leaned forward, eager. "Are we talking internal changes or something bigger?" Rebecca smiled, her resolve unwavering. "Bigger. We're launching the Sterling Fund, a $50 million initiative dedicated to providing fair loans and financial education for Black and brown entrepreneurs who've been historically overlooked." The room fell silent. Edward blinked in disbelief. "50 million?" he asked, almost in shock. Rebecca nodded. "And that's just the start." One of the older board members frowned, her concern obvious. "How do we justify this to our investors?" "We justify it the same way we justify any business move," Rebecca replied confidently. "This isn't charity, it's strategy. The racial wealth gap isn't just a social issue, it's an economic one. Investing in underserved communities isn't a risk, it's an opportunity. Edward's face was tight with concern. There will be backlash, Rebecca. Rebecca's gaze didn't waver. From who? The same people who didn't want us to acknowledge discrimination? They weren't on our side to begin with. A few younger executives nodded, their unease easing. Rebecca folded her arms and looked around the room. I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you what's happening. Sterling Bank is going to lead the industry, and it won't be built on outdated policies or fear. It will be built on progress. There was a moment of silence as the room absorbed her words. Edward let out a resigned sigh. You really are fearless. Rebecca smiled, her voice steady. No, I'm done playing small. One by one, heads nodded in agreement. The meeting ended, and Naomi, ever the strategist, was already on her phone. You just turned a moment into a movement, she said, a hint of pride in her voice. Later that evening, Rebecca stopped by Sterling Bank. Sandra, the new teller, was handling customers with respect and efficiency. Rebecca approached the counter. Miss Carter, how can I help you? Sandra asked. Rebecca smiled. Just checking in. Sandra hesitated. What you did today, it meant a lot to us. Rebecca nodded. Good. Let's make sure it lasts. As she left, Rebecca felt the weight of the day settle in. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready. This was just the beginning.